And we are back on Buildface TV. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and on today's episode, we are going to be talking about Radlands again, and specifically, we are going to be talking about event cards within the game of Radlands. So there's a couple things I want to get out of the way to begin with. First of all, there are 2 copies of every event card in Radlands, unlike People, where the best, most powerful people within the game, there's only 1 copy each. All events are 2 of, so they're kind of more... They're more the same, I guess. There's more symmetry among events in that way, as opposed to where People, there's these peak power spikes where they have one of a kinds. Next up, generally I am not doing how to play stuff. I kind of come to these reviews with the assumption that you have a little bit of knowledge about the game, you understand the basics of how to play it. However, I think in order to properly evaluate event cards, we do have to touch on a little bit of how to play stuff. The junk effects on event cards are just too important. So if we're not all on the same page with regard to how valuable something is with as far as a junk effect, then it's tough to really evaluate the card. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Destroy takes something completely out of the game. It kills it. If it's a People, it puts it in the KO pile. If it's a camp, it turns the camp face down. It cannot be healed after that. Damage allows you to take something from either ready to damaged or damaged to dead. It has to be an unprotected card. Injure works the same as damage, except it can only target People. Restore is essentially the healing action, where if something has taken 1 hit of damage, you restore it to heal it back up. That means camps or People, unless card specifically says only one or the other. Draw gets you another card out of the deck. Water is how you pay for things. It's the currency within Radlands. Gaining a Punk, I don't think that's going to come up today. I'm pretty sure the only cards that have the gain a Punk power on their junk effect are the legendary cards, but we'll see if my memory is wrong on that. And finally, raids. We're going to talk about raiding a lot today because I think raids are the most impactful, most important event in the entire game. But to start off, we're going to talk about Famine. So again, there's 2 copies of Famine, as is the case with all other events within the game. So, Famine is a 1-cost event that can be junked to injure a person. So again, this only means you can hurt a person. You can't use this to damage a camp, which should be calculated into how we evaluate this card. It is a... Oh, you know what? I'm going to talk about one other thing before we actually dive into the card analysis, and that's how the event track works. This is really, really important. The maximum number of events that you can have in play at any given time in a game of Radlands is 3. If this card, now I realize this is a 0 event track, but just bear with me for the example here. If this is at the 1 slot in the event track and you want to play this card that says 1, it goes to the 2. Most events, there is no way to accelerate them in the game other than, I think, just the Omen clock. So if I play this event here and it's in my 1 slot, I can't junk a card to push a raid past this event. It acts as a kind of a bottleneck, and that's true of all your events. So you need to think about and be aware of, hey, how long is this thing going to be living within the event track, and what kind of opportunity cost does that have? And that's something that I'm going to come back to a lot within this video, because I think it's the key point, the fundamental principle in how you play events is the management of the event track. So Famine, it's a 1 cost, and it's a 1 track, so it'll start in slot 1 on the event track. Each player starting with you destroys all but 1 of their people. So the best use case for this is when you have nothing on the board and you have a decent hand, and your opponent has spent everything in their hand to develop really good board presence, and then you pop this thing out and they have 1 turn to use all the people that they have in play or lose them. That is when this card looks best. When this card is just dead in your hand is when your opponent does not actually have a board. The problem I have with Famine as a card, while it is cheap and it does do something that sometimes will be really impactful, like I'm not saying the effect is bad when the board is ripe for it, but if your opponent is playing a strategy where they're not putting people in play and they're not relying on people in play, then this junk effect doesn't do anything, and this main effect doesn't do anything, and this is a dead card. So right out of the gate, I'm going to throw Famine down as a tier 3, a bronze level event. Again, just I guess one more point of clarification. I don't think there are any totally unplayable cards in this game, so I don't have a tier 4. I don't have a dumpster tier in this review. I'm going to put these cards... Gold tier is the ones that I think have the best use cases or the widest variety of use cases, so they're going to be the most useful to you. Obviously, silver is a little bit worse. And bronze, these are not dumpster cards, these are not trash cards, but I think these are some of the less valuable, the least valuable events in the game. I suppose, like all YouTubers, I should say, this is just my opinion. If you disagree, that's okay. Yeah, everybody knows it's my opinion. I know, that's the nature of these types of channels. Anyway, moving on to the next event, we have Interrogate. Now, this is an event that I actually like. While in general, I am pretty skeptical as to pouring resources into any events within Radlands, again, because of how the event track works. Even strong events, if they clog the event track and prevent you from doing other things, that opportunity cost could get you, even if the payoff in the event is quite good. But Interrogate has a event track of 0. So when you play this card, you get to use it right away, which is a really important feature of this card. Its junk effect is a water. This is essentially a lateral movement in a lot of ways, trading one card for... I guess it's not even a lateral movement, because to replace this one card using water, it costs 2 water to draw 1 card, and this card is worth 1 water. So junking this for its water effect essentially gives you half a card to replace the card that you junked. That doesn't feel great, but the times where you need just 1 more water to pull off your combo, to play the effect that's going to put a damage on somebody else, that kind of effect matters, but in general, this is a junk effect that I do not value very highly on any cards, whether it's an event or a person. The main effect on Interrogate is draw 4 cards, then discard 3 of these. This is fine. It does cost 1 to do it, so you're spending a water to get to choose from 4 different cards and gain 1 card back to your hand. That is a better exchange rate than junking this for a water and then using that to draw, plus you have some card selection. So this card is much better than the default game rules pay 2 to draw a card. It's better across a couple of axes. That said, as an event, is this where I want my water to go in? Nothing about this text down here actively wins me the game. Yes, it might give me the tool I need to win the game, but it also might not. It also might end up with another copy of this card in my hand and 3 other things that don't help me. So you're kind of rolling the dice a little bit, but considering that you get to choose from amongst 4 different cards and all the cards have multiple uses within the game, the likelihood that you're not going to hit something that has a good junk effect or a good play effect is pretty slim. Generally speaking, when I'm in a position to interrogate, I end up being able to choose from amongst enough options that I find something that works pretty well. As far as events go, I think this is actually one of the better events in the game, even if it has the weakest possible junk effect. The 0 on the event track, I think, helps it as an event a great deal. Next up, we have Truce. This card's junk effect is to injure a person. So again, you have to have people your opponent has to have people in play. You can't target your own people with injure effects, unless it specifically says so. But you can't like throw a card and hit your own person. So limited little, your opponent has to play into you being able to use this effect, but in most games, most players put stuff on the board, so it's likely that this will have an opportunity to use it. It is another 0 track event, which I think is really important to this card. Any of the cards that have 0, any of the events that have 0 on the track, I think automatically bump them up, and that has everything to do with raiders, which I'll get to a little later in the video. This returns all people to their owner's hands. Punks are people. So there's a couple different things that Truce can do for you. One, it can clear the board. If your opponent had to save up a water silo, junk a couple cards to get enough water, and they finally built a decent sized board, and for only 2 water you're able to erase everything that they did, it might take them 2 turns to deploy all those resources again, which puts you in a very comfortable position to maybe pick off one of their camps while they're trying to rebuild, or get a decent amount of protection in front of your camps while they're trying to rebuild. The other thing that this does is its sneaky backdoor draw effects. If you have one of the camps, I think it's the arcade, that lets you spawn punks essentially for no cost, or if you have other ways to get punks into play, either through your people or other events, this card can essentially say pay 2 water, draw. I mean, the maximum use case, if you have 6 punks in play, this card is pay 2 water, draw 6 cards. Now, how often are you going to see that Rainbow Unicorn Land kind of play? Probably not that often, and I totally acknowledge that. Generally, though, if you're paying 2, you're messing up what your opponent's doing, and you're drawing 1 or 2 punks. If you're drawing 1 punk with this card off your side of the board, everything else is gravy because that's on rate. By default game rules, you can pay 2 water and draw 1 card. A punk being in play once it's returned to your hand has the exact same effect as drawing a card. You just flip the card over, here's the punk. Oh, what is it? Oh, it's Truce. Now it's in my hand. If you get even 1 card with that, you're paying the same rate, plus you have the gravy effect of bouncing everybody. Bounce. I played Magic in the 90s. Bounce means return to hand. Anyway, this is a strong effect. This can backbreak your opponent in some use cases. It can act as backdoor draw in other use cases, and it can just be a little bit of a caltrop that you throw down and your opponent kind of I hurt my foot on my way to trying to get to your camps. I think Truce has a lot of use cases, even though it has what I would consider one of the weaker junk effects. The 0 track on the event track helps it a great deal. Next up, we have Strafe. This is a card that lets you throw it away, the junk effect, to draw 1 card. So when you're drawing 1 card, you're essentially trading this for a mystery box. You don't know what you're going to get. Now, you do kind of have some idea throughout the flow of the game. You can see what cards have been played, what cards, well, I haven't seen Mulgar yet. Maybe this will turn into Mulgar. Maybe it's a boat. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. I do actually like cards that have the junk effect to cycle because sometimes that's all you need. You throw that, you get that 1 more card. Oh, there's the water I needed. I can junk Interrogate. Now I have that 5th water so I can play my combo, whatever it is. This is one of the more solid junk effects in my opinion. This card costs 2. Again, it is a 0 event track. I did not organize these events to put all the zeros up front, but this is a 0 use of the event track, which means it happens as soon as you play it. I've already said at length with these 2 other cards how much that matters in terms of valuing an event card, in my opinion. And the effect is injure all unprotected enemies. So this will not hit camps, but if you can combine this card with something like the Gunner, who injures all unprotected enemies, and then you injure all unprotected enemies, this could have the effect of acting as part of a board wipe. Now, you notice here this costs 2. I believe the Gunner also costs 2, which means that's total cost 4. That at least a 2-turn combo to set that up, unless you have a card that you can junk for water. So it's not the most reliable kind of combo, but nonetheless, this does have some really high upside potential. The drawback to this is if your opponent is not if they have enough of a board to where they're able to put punks or other trash mobs in front of their valuable guys, this is just not good enough. You're paying 2 water to sort of halfway get to the thing that needs addressed, and in a lot of cases, that's going to be too slow. So there are definitely use cases where I think Strafe looks really, really good, and it does have a strong effect. Overall, though, you have to pair this with something else. You have to be able to pair this with other ways of damaging your opponent, or chip damage, or injure of some kind. Otherwise, it's just a dead card. By itself, this does almost nothing, unless your opponent has built badly and put the important, they put their sniper in the front row for some reason. Cool, take advantage of that, exploit that. But if what you're relying on is your opponent putting their most important characters in unprotected positions to get value out of a card, how reliable is that? Maybe at the kitchen table, you can reliably get value out of Strafe. Against players that are a little bit more sophisticated, I think you're going to find that often this is kind of a lateral move at best. You're going to be picking off things that don't matter as much, and maybe not even killing things. Next up, we have Bombardment. Now, this holds the distinction of being the most expensive event in the entire game at 4 cost. The most expensive cards in the game are 4 cost. It's this, and it's Mulgar Stain. All the other legendaries cost 3. And pretty much every other card in the game either costs 1 or 2 for the most part. Bombardment. Now, this does have the junk effect of restoring something. I think that's arguably the most, if not the second, or possibly the second most important junk effect in the entire game. Healing is massive. If your opponent has to invest an entire turn, maybe 4 or 5 water, maybe one of their people goes down in the process, and they put all these resources into hitting a camp 1 turn, and then you just go, okay, I'm going to junk this, and I'm going to reverse everything you did. You can 1 for 4. You can 1 for 5 your opponent in terms of resource burn. Healing is fairly scarce in Radlands, and it is impactful. It is a big deal. It's less impactful with people because, generally speaking, when you have a damaged person and you heal them, they're not ready that turn. So you have to wait a whole nother cycle in order to be able to use their stuff, which, are they still going to be ready next time it rolls around? Like, if you damage my guy, I use my whole turn to heal my guy, and then you damage my guy again, well, you basically time walked me. I skipped my entire turn because I didn't do anything. All of that said, healing is just, it can't be over, it can, well, everything can be overvalued. You can certainly make misplays by overvaluing one aspect of the game or another, but in terms of board swing, healing is one of the, if not the single strongest effect in the game. So for cost, you're not going to be able to play this unless you have a card you can junk for water or you water siloed in a previous turn, which definitely restricts the play space where this can come down. You're going to be using probably your entire turn to do this, and it doesn't do anything for 3 more turns. So the turn I play it, it's in event track 3. Next start of my turn, it moves up to 2. Next start of my turn, it moves up to 1. As long as my opponent didn't play the, I can't think of what the guy's called, the shaman guy, the guy that pushes events back. 4 turns later, you finally get the value out of this. Now, what is the value that you get after you wait for what could be the entire length of the game? I've had games that have ended in 3 turns. Well, the value is damage all the opponent's camps, then draw a card for each destroyed camp they have. In my experience, you almost never get to draw those cards. If your opponent has the ability to see this coming, they will invest resources, maybe even suboptimally invest resources in making sure that their camps are healed when this pops off, so all you're doing is damaging camps and you're not drawing extra cards. I have almost never seen this get the kind of value where you get the card draw. And I think part of the reason why is because game pace in Radlands is often so fast. So I play this out. Let me rephrase that sentence. If I wait to play this out until my opponent has a damaged camp or maybe 2 damaged camps already, this is not going to go off before the game ends. Most of the time. Not always, like as in card games, the correct answer to every question is it depends, but that's not super helpful. What I think is more helpful is to try to describe the preponderance of use cases where a card could apply, or the most likely scenario that you're going to see. And the most likely scenario you're going to see with this, if you play it early, you're going to get good value out of damaging your opponent's camps. If you play it later in the game and you try to get greedy about this drawing the card, in my experience, it just doesn't work out. The game tends to end. If you wait until 1 or 2 camps are damaged or destroyed already to try to ensure that you're going to get that card draw, the game's going to be over before this thing makes it up the event track. Maybe the exception is if you have the Omen Clock and you play this one turn, maybe you get 5 water that turn and you accelerate it, then your next turn it moves by itself and you use the Omen Clock again. So there are narrow use cases where you might see that card draw, but overall, I do not think you can count on that card draw. I do think this card is overcosted at 4, even though the effect is really strong. I am not a big fan of Bombardment. I almost always use it to heal a camp. Oh, man. So I'm going to put this at the silver tier, and here's why. When it goes off, it does a super powerful thing. We can't ignore it. We can't pretend that damaging all of your opponent's camps in one effect is not good. It's amazing. That's a tier 1 effect. The fact that you have to wait 4 turns for it is not a tier 1 effect. The fact that your opponent might have ways to manipulate it and push it back and hold you back some is not a great effect. And the way this interacts with your ability to pop off raids left and right is not a great effect. Mix all that together with the fact that this has a very strong junk effect, and I think what you have is just a solid middle of the road card. Tier 1 ability, tier 3 drawbacks, tier 1 junk effect. Hence, I think it's a tier 2 card. So silver for Bombardment. I went into this sure I was going to put that in tier 3, but having talked it out, I've now decided I'll give it silver. Next up, we have High Ground. So this is a 0 cost event, which is something that I really, really like. I wish more of the events were cheap like that, and I wish more of the events were less cloggy of the event track. But this is a 0 cost event. It goes into the slot on 1, so you only have to wait 1 turn for this to go off, which is important. Its junk effect is water. I've already talked about what I think about that. Rearrange your people. This turn, all the opponent's cards are unprotected. So let's talk about these 2 effects separately. First of all, rearranging your people. Not often super useful. Generally speaking, as you play the game, you build your board in such a way that you're optimizing where your people go every time. Now, that said, there are going to be times where your opponent has some kind of sneak attack thing that hits a camp, and now, oh man, this camp's completely undefended, and this camp has 2 people in front of it. That's terrible. And having the ability to move your people over and reformate to protect, essentially to react to what's been happening within the board, there are times where that's useful, and it is something you should keep your eye on. But overall, I don't think that's the reason you play this card. I think the reason you play this card is the second sentence. This turn, all your opponent's cards are unprotected. Essentially, this, in the same way that Truce completely nullifies your opponent's board state, this card, the net effect is remove all people from play. Well, all opposing people from play. You get to just crack at camps using any kind of damage effect. So if you have, I'm drawing a blank on card names right now, but if you have the Pyromaniac, I think it is. No, he only injures people. The Looter. The Looter is a card that can damage a person or can damage a camp. Even if you have 2 people in front of your camp, on the turn when High Ground pops off, Looter is able to hit that camp and completely ignore those people. That is really strong. This is a end the game card. This is a kill your opponent type card. It does come down on track 1, so I don't think the use of the event track can really be held against this card in the same way that it is relevant against a card like Bombardment or even Famine. So I like High Ground a great deal, although a lot of times I find myself using this for its very anemic junk effect just to get something else in play. I tend to value people over events. Man, is this tier 1? I don't think... So this is another one that I'm struggling with because I think the majority of the time, High Ground is not the best card. But some of the time, it wins you the game outright by making all of your opponent's camps vulnerable. So we'll put it there for now, and we'll move on to Banish. I might revisit High Ground before we finish this, though. Banish, the subject of a number of memes already. I think the effect... So let's start with the effect here. I think the effect on this card, it goes into the event track of 1. So the turn you play it, it costs 1. Doesn't do anything the turn you play it. The next turn, it lets you destroy any enemy. This is good because it gets around protection. So if your opponent has like a Mulgar Stain or a Varavosh or a Sniper or a Scientist or some other high-value target in the back row and they have somebody protecting them in front of them and you have no other way to get to that character, like a Mulgar in particular is a great example. If you can't get to Mulgar, he wins the game in 3 turns if he's allowed to go off. Generally, because he's so expensive, he doesn't come out until there's already been some damage done, in which case he might win the game in only 2 turns if he comes out to a board where there's already one of the opposing camps destroyed. So there are times where this card is going to look good. You're going to get a nuke somebody who's hiding, who you wouldn't otherwise have been able to deal with. It deals 2 damage. That's essentially what destroy means. Deal 2 damage. It kills the guy outright instead of turning them sideways for a turn. Those are all good effects, and for the cost of 1, that's actually cheap. That's below rate for all of that. All of that being said, if your opponent doesn't have a high-value target, if your opponent has exposed high-value targets, if your opponent isn't relying on a strategy that is people-heavy, this just doesn't matter. This does have some of the coolest art in the game, though. This is one of my favorite pieces of art. All of that said, my favorite thing about this card is this little symbol right here. So as a refresher, this little symbol right here, or right, let's see, there, or right there, means to either start or advance your raid. Your raid is the single best event in the game, but I'm going to talk about that at the end. I think this card in 99% of games is more valuable junking it for this effect than it is ever doing this. This does not move you towards winning the game necessarily. Yes, getting your opponent's people out of the way is a way that you can get to their camps, and so bank shot, it does advance the game state towards winning. Yes, if your opponent has some powerful character like a sniper in play that's chipping apart your camps even though you are set up on the board, this would stop that from happening. Not losing is not the same thing as winning the game. So I look at this as this sort of helps you not lose. This absolutely helps you win. Advancing your raid is more important almost every time than this effect, and potentially putting this effect on the event track could stop you from advancing your raid. So I am going to put Banish right up here, but I'm going to put it in tier 1 on the condition that we ignore the rest of the card and only look at the raid. No, that's not true. Again, there are use cases where the event text on this card is relevant, and as a sophisticated player of Radlands, you're going to have to be able to do analysis in real time and decide, is moving my raid up 1 going to help me win the game this turn, or am I going to lose if I don't try to use this to kill an enemy? Again, I think the majority of use cases, raid is more important. Next up, we have Napalm. Napalm is a 2-cost event that comes out on event track 1, and it destroys all enemies in 1 column. This is an event I actually really like. Your opponent does not have that much time to react to it. So if your opponent has 2 enemies in 1 column, and often if they've played something powerful or valuable, they put it in the back and they put something in front of it to protect it. Even if it's fully healed 2 enemies, this thing kills them both. This thing takes out Mulgar, this thing takes out Vera, this thing takes out everything in 1 hit. You don't have to deal with damaging, it nukes them. This is actually a very strong event. And unlike Bombardment, it's a very strong event that doesn't clog your event track for 4 turns and doesn't cost you at least a water silo on top of your regular water allotment for a turn. It also has an extremely powerful heal effect for its junk. All in all, this is one of maybe the best event cards in the game because of its versatility. Unlike Banish, where the event text, I think, isn't going to see that much use, and often even when you do have a board state where you could use it, it might be better to use it for its junk text. Napalm does fall into that a little bit. You're going to have times with this card where it's like, oh man, next turn I could kill both those guys and that would be really good, but if I don't heal now, I might just lose before then. You're going to have these fun, well, I think fun, tough choice situations where you have a meaningful choice between 2 very viable lines of play where they both matter. And you know what? I've talked myself into it without even thinking. I'm gonna jump Banish down because it does not put you in the situation where you have to make a meaningful choice between both effects on the card in the way that Napalm does. I can't have these 2 cards being at the same rank. And in fact, I think I'm gonna bump high ground down too. All right, next up we have Uprising. So this is an interesting card. The junk effect is relatively weak. I'm not a huge fan of Injure. It requires your opponent to play a kind of a certain way and making sure that their board lines up with you drawing this card at the same time. I'd rather have a healing there. I'd rather have a raid there. It costs 1, which is cheap, and it puts 3 punks in play. If this event has gone off and then you have this card in hand, that means for 3 water between the 2 events, you drew 3 cards. That is a big deal combo. That's really good. I don't like that this comes out on event track 2. Having the extra 3 things, this lets you protect your entire board. If on your turn 1, you go first and you play this, your opponent gets a turn, this comes back, it's still clogging your event track. So the best use case of this, I think, is you get it out on turn 1, and then on turn 3, you get to throw down punks protecting all your camps. In some games, that is extremely strong, and in some games, you're already almost dead by the time it comes out. I think this event is a little bit too slow. This by itself does nothing. It doesn't help you win the game. It barely even provides speed bumps to slow your opponent down from them winning the game. I think alone, this is easily a bronze tier card. But, again, if you can couple it with other cards that let you get value out of punks, like Truce, or like some camps and people that key off checking if punks are in play, if you have those combo cards, this starts to look much, much better. But if this is what you're relying on to try to prevent your opponent from killing you, to me, that seems like a desperation play. So I'm going to put Uprising down here with the caveat that while I think overall this is a bronze tier event, there are certain combos that it can be a part of within the game that would bump it up to silver, and there's sometimes where it even looks really good. Last event that goes in the player deck is Radiation. This is a 1, comes out on the event track 1, so you get it the turn after you play it. It injures all people. I think this is a strictly worse Truce in basically every way. They cost the same. This injures people, which doesn't necessarily actually get them out of the way, although it is important to injure characters that have to be ready in order to use their powers. Making sure that they're injured is valuable, so there are times where this will be, oh man, I have to do it. But honestly, anytime I have to use it for this effect, I feel bad that I'm not using it for this effect. So I guess I have to put this here given everything I said about Banish. I do think both of these raids, if I look at all the junk icons on these cards, these 2 raid icons are the most important, or tied for the most important, with these 2 heal icons. The injure icon, which is the most plentiful on the event cards, is I think one of the weakest, if not, well, no, water is the weakest, and that only appears on 2 of the cards. So overall, when you're looking at event cards, they kind of run the range of having mediocre junk effects all the way up through excellent, powerful effects. And there's a handful of the event cards that I think are actually worth playing most of the time when you see them, and not just automatically junking them. I will note that out of the 3 that I put in gold tier, only 1 of them actually makes use of the event track. Both Interrogate and Truce instantly resolve. Down here we have 1 and 2 on the event track, and of course the worst offender of the event track that comes out on a 3, I ended up putting at silver tier. So the final event I want to talk about today is, of course, the raid. Now, I've reached the point where I don't feel the need to play the card on this side anymore, but anytime I'm teaching the game to new people, I make sure that this is the side that's up so they know what's going on. This comes out on the event track 2, and your opponent damages a camp of their choice once it resolves. So if all you have is 1 raid icon, this comes out at 2, the subsequent turn it moves up to 1, and the turn after that. So it takes a full 3 turns for this to resolve, and it deals 1 damage to an opposing camp. Now that does seem a little bit anemic. I understand that by itself. But where these cards get crazy is using multiple raids. If you have a camp that you can pay 1, like the garage, or 2, like the victory totem, and advance the raid, well, you junk Radiation, you start the raid, you pay 2 to your victory totem and advance it 1 more. And if you have the garage as well, your 3rd water for the turn, this goes off and you get a camp damage. Next turn, victory totem, garage, maybe you have a holdout, so you pay 1 more. There you go, damage again. The beauty of the raid is that it is just infinite damage that is uninteractable. There's only 1 card in the game. Is the Doomsayer, I think the guy's name is? There's only 1 card in the game that lets you push your opponent's events back. So having your raids flow through and being able to move them up multiple times each turn, I think is the most reliable key to victory. Now, not every draw and not every camp composition is going to let you pull off that kind of consistency with your raids. But that is a door I like to keep open for myself. And the worst thing you can do is shut that door on yourself by, say, playing Radiation out, then starting a raid and going, oh, I have the 2 water for victory totem, but I can't advance it because now there's this in the way. And that is the most important, the key element to expertly navigating raids, to knowing what you're doing, to managing your raid track, is making sure that if you want to raid or advance a raid, that needs to take priority over basically any other event in the game. If there is a gold tier of events, it is raids number 1, everything else in a distant second. This really is, I think, the key, most crucial element to winning the majority of games that I have won, is that I raid more than my opponent. I spend my resources on advancing my raids more than my opponent does, and often that's it. That's the only difference in play, is I make sure my raids get through and my opponent is not as aggressive in that area. So I think the biggest drawback to any event in this game is that it slows down how often you can raid. And the key, the real expert level play, is making sure that you manage the events that you want to get out so you can get the value out of these cards and not just treat them as automatic junk, but also make sure that your raids move and flow seamlessly without any issues. All right, that's our review of events. This has been the Build Phase. Go win some games.